Hey, I'm Femi Redwood. I'm the host of a newish podcast called Beyond Black History Month. So you know how black barbershops today are often hangout spots where black men can talk life, politics, relationship? Well, the earliest forms of barbershops were the exact opposite. Black barbers didn't serve black customers. In this week's podcast, I spoke with Quincy Mills. He's an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland, College Park. He researched the history of black barbershops and wrote about it in his book, Cutting Along the Color Line. Let's start at the beginning with slavery. Black men became barbers as enslaved people. The enslavers wanted a body servant.
They wanted someone to groom them and to wait on them in certain kinds of ways. And so they would often tap one of their enslaved to sort of do that work. During times of economic downturn in the plantation economy, they being enslavers, would often hire out their enslaved in the city. Particularly their skilled folks, enslaved folk who were skilled. They would hire them out in the city to earn money. Some of that money they could keep. The other part of it they would have to give to the enslaver.
Some black barbers were free men.
So free black barbers would take on enslaved barbers, train them, and have them work in the shop on their own time, right? This obviously gave those enslaved barbers a sense of mobility, sense of freedom from the plantation. But to be clear, they were still enslaved. Whenever the enslaver wanted them back, they had to go back to the plantation, right? So it was a fleeting freedom, if you will, right? A quasi-freedom, but obviously free is free. There's no middle ground here.
All of this creates this sort of interesting dynamic.
What would compel a white man to sit in a barber's chair with an enslaved or free black barber standing over them with a straight razor? Why would they even trust the barber to do that? Well, they had to believe in the fantasies of black inferiority. They had to believe that these black barbers were quite frankly incapable of striking violence against them. They had to believe this fantasy. That drive to have a black servant was of more value to them than the thought of losing their life.
White men who were born in America had no interest in working as a barber because they associated it with slave labor. Here's what they thought.
If it's work that enslaved folk are doing, then it must be unskilled, because those enslaved folk, they're not smart enough to do skilled work. So as a white man, I'm not going to be a barber because that's beneath me.
Immigrant men, specifically those who were German and Irish, they saw things differently.
They had been barbers in the old country, so they had no hang-up. They understood, right, they understood the opportunity, right? They understood the industry, the field. Native white men, not so much.
So barbers in the North, white and immigrant. Barbers in the South, black. And there's a strong possibility that some of these shops in the South were part of the Underground Railroad.
There's small evidence that when the lights turned out and the close sign went on, that maybe there was something happening outside of normal business hours. And so I do talk about the book as a couple of pieces of evidence to indicate that during slavery, that there were barbers who would house African Americans who were fleeing slavery, and they just needed a spot to rest overnight, but they'd have to be gone by the morning when they opened the shop door. So I think there was more happening that frankly the record just doesn't fully flesh out, the record being the archive.
If you want to hear the rest of this episode, including how black men were kicked out of barbering, you can listen to the full podcast. You can find Beyond Black History Month on basically all of the podcast players. We're on Spotify, Apple, Google, Stitcher, and on the Odyssey app. There's also a link below.